long as we live, we are free.
Morning in Liberty was drenched in dust. The sun had barely risen, yet its light poured down on cracked rooftops and dirt streets that shimmered with heat. In front of the old courthouse, a crowd had gathered. Their murmurs rose, then broke into silence, as if even the sound of breath might awaken a curse that hovered in the air. The judge struck his gavel, voice dry as chalk. Opening the auction. 1 wooden cabin and 12 acres of land, including a well, a barn, and an abandoned cattle shed. Starting bid, 12 cents. A ripple moved through the crowd. 12 cents, so cheap it was almost a joke. Yet not a single hand went up. The wealthy traders kept quiet, the big ranch lords stayed frozen in place. Heads lowered, eyes averted. Everyone knew the cabin carried a shadow. To raise a hand was to invite death. Then came a hoarse voice. 12 cents. I'll take it. Every head snapped toward the speaker. Gideon Hail, dust-caked, threadbare, a broke rancher with sunken eyes and a ragged herd of cattle, stood with his calloused hand raised high. The gavel fell. Sold. The cabin and land now belonged to Gideon Hail. There was no applause, no congratulations, only pity in the eyes staring back at him, as if the man had walked straight into his own coffin. That evening, Gideon rode his old horse down the dirt road with his cattle trailing behind. The path cut through sparse woods, where blackened tree stumps jutted like skeletal arms. In the distance, half buried in wild grass, stood the weathered gate of his new home. He slowed, his chest tightened. Hanging from the beam of the gate was a body. Not a man but a woman, an Apache giant. Her frame was immense, taller than any man Gideon had ever seen. Even strung up, her feet nearly touched the ground. Broad shoulders, long legs, arms built like steel. Her face was smeared with dust and blood. Her eyes, barely open, quivered with the last flickers of breath. Hell! Gideon leapt from the saddle, knife flashing. He slashed the rope. The damn trap. Night had fallen by the time Gideon dragged the woman into the cabin. Dust choked the air, but the floor was solid. The stove still carried cold ash. It didn't feel like a place abandoned for 15 years, as the town claimed. He laid her on the rough wooden table and covered her with a blanket. Studying her face, he realized he knew her from stories. Traders spoke of Naelli, granddaughter of Chief Whitehawk, a warrior-blooded giant, legendary for her height and strength. And now here she was, barely alive inside his 12-cent cabin. Who had strung her up at his gate? Who dared hang the chief's granddaughter like a spectacle? From the porch, Gideon scanned the fading tree line. At the edge of the woods stood a lone rider. His wide-brimmed hat was rimmed in silver, catching the last light of dusk. The man did not approach. He only stared. Then, when their eyes met, he wheeled his horse and vanished into the trees. Cold prickled Gideon's spine. Someone was watching. Inside, Naelli stirred. Her voice rasped like dry wind, broken English slipping through. Danger. They will come back. Gideon clenched his calloused fists. He was no hero, just a weary cowhand looking for rest with a scrawny herd. But the cabin he bought for 12 cents had dragged him into a war he never asked for. That night, he sat awake beside her bed, Winchester rifle within reach. Outside, the prairie wind moaned through the boards. Shadows crept across the cabin walls like waiting specters. Gideon muttered, eyes fixed on the fire's last ember. What in God's name have I bought? At dawn, he rode into town. Naelli needed bandages and medicine. When he stepped into the general store, conversation died. Women pretended to browse cloth but stole nervous glances his way. The wiry shopkeeper packed supplies in silence. When Gideon admitted he had bought the cabin at Crow's Gate, the 12-cent cabin became a spark for blood and fire. The prairie burned orange as Gideon rode back toward the 12-cent cabin. A heavy sack of medicine, bandages, and dried food weighed against his saddle. Yet heavier still was the echo of Fletcher Knox's words, cold as a chain dragging across stone. I'm buying your good sense. That cabin's not for a man who wants to live long. His old horse snorted uneasily. As they neared the gate, Gideon's eyes lifted. The rope he had cut still dangled, stiff with dried blood. The beam bore the scar like a warning carved into the wood. Inside, the firelight painted gold over the cracked planks. Naelli was awake. She sat propped against the wall, her dark eyes fixed on him, fierce even through her bruises. You came back, she rasped, her English halting but clearer. Why not take the money? Gideon set the bag down, poured her a tin cup of water. He shrugged. I couldn't stomach watching a human strung up like livestock. And if that shack is worth $500, then it's hiding something worth far more. Naelli drank slowly, then clutched the blanket to her shoulders. I am granddaughter of White Hawk, chief of the Apache. They captured me to force my people silent. They hung me at the gate to send a message. Speak nothing or die. Her gaze sharpened, cutting through the dim cabin light. This house belonged to Samuel Hartwell. He found forged land deeds, proof that the judge and the governor sold stolen ground. They killed him, buried the secret here. I was hung at the gate to remind the town, and to erase the truth. Gideon's chest grew heavy. His 12-cent bargain had become a coffin of secrets. Outside, the wind carried a strange sound. Hammers striking, horses shifting. Gideon peered through a slit in the boards. Shadows moved along the tree line. Fletcher's men were making camp. Naelli's voice came firm now, though roughened by pain. You saved me. Now you must fight with me. If not, we will both hang at that gate. Draped over her shoulders, the riders flinched, some muttering curses. The ghost of the woman they had strung up now stood alive, unbroken. You tried to kill me, Naelli's voice rang harsh but steady. Because I know the truth. But my blood will not buy you silence. Fletcher narrowed his eyes. His hand hovered near his gun, then eased away. Tough girl. But you see, Gideon, she'll drag you into a grave. Let her go. Keep your life. Gideon glanced at Naelli. In her eyes there was no fear, only belief. He spat into the dirt. I paid for this cabin. It's mine. And any man lays a hand on this woman, he'll pay in blood. The silence stretched taut as a drawn bowstring. Fletcher lifted his hand. Rifles cracked in unison. Bullets tore through the walls. Gideon dragged Naelli inside, shouting, "Grab that Colt! Tonight we fight!" Gunfire screamed through the wood, splinters flying like sparks. Gideon shoved Naelli to the floor and shouldered his Winchester. The rifle thundered, dropping one rider at the fence. Smoke filled the cabin, choking the air. Naelli, though weak, gripped the Colt. Her large hands trembled but did not falter. She squeezed the trigger. Bang! A man fell dead beneath the very gate where she herself had once swung. The cabin gate had become a boundary marked in blood. "There's too many of them," Gideon growled, sweat and powder smearing his face. He flipped the wooden table, braced behind it, and rammed new shells into the Winchester. Outside, Fletcher's voice bellowed, "Burn it! Burn the cabin, and burn them in it." A torch arced through the night, landed on the dry thatch roof. Flames roared to life, painting the sky gold. The fire gleamed in Naelli's eyes. She gritted her teeth, rose to her full height, casting a towering shadow over Gideon. "They will not have this cabin, and they will not have me." A horn sounded in the distance, low and deep like thunder rolling from the hills. This was only the beginning. The cabin's true secret still lay buried, and the men behind Fletcher, Judge Crane and Governor Webb, were wolves yet to show their teeth. Dawn came red as spilled blood. Smoke curled from the cabin's roof. The field stank of gunpowder and charred flesh. Apache warriors stamped out the last flames, dragging bodies aside, forming a wall of defense. Through the haze strode Chief Whitehawk. His long silver hair streamed in the wind, eyes blazing with fire despite their age. He wrapped his arms around Naelli, who bowed her massive frame into his embrace. Tears cut lines through soot on her cheeks. "My granddaughter lives," the chief rumbled, "but the enemy will return." "This cabin hides what they want buried forever." Gideon turned toward the scorched floor. He remembered Naelli's words about Samuel Hartwell. Kneeling, he noticed a square patch of planks sealed with hardened black resin. "Here," he whispered. Warriors swung axes. The blows shook the cabin. Resin cracked, wood splintered. At last, the floor gave way, revealing a dark hollow. From it, Gideon pulled a rusted iron chest and a heavy leather pouch. The lid creaked open. Inside lay scrolls, land deeds, government seals, each stamped with Judge Crane's hand and Governor Webb's bold signature. Proof of forgery, theft, and bribes. Gideon's fists clenched. His 12-cent cabin was no bargain. It was the spark of a fire that could consume an empire. The next morning, the sun bled red across the horizon, like a wound torn open above the prairie. Smoke still curled from the cabin's scorched roof, mingling with the acrid stench of gunpowder and burnt flesh. The wind carried the chill of night, but the ground remained warm with the memory of fire. The yard before the gate was littered with corpses. Horses twisted in their final fall. Mercenaries stiffened in grotesque shapes. The Apache survivors moved with grim efficiency. Women hauled buckets to drown stubborn embers. Children collected broken arrows with solemn eyes. Warriors circled outward, repairing barricades and watching for movement on the distant ridges. Gideon sat slumped on the charred porch steps, his rough hands still trembling after the night's slaughter. In his mind, Echoes of the battle still thundered. War cries, hooves pounding, bullets screaming through wood. Beside him stood Naelli, her long dark hair tangled, her bruised face lit by a fire that refused to fade. Her eyes fixed on the iron chest cracked open before them. Chief Whitehawk entered the cabin, his tall frame carrying a weight of both grief and authority. Gideon rose and handed him the stack of documents. Page after page bore the blood-red seals and the sharp signatures of Judge William Crane and Governor Marcus Webb. Naelli's voice trembled as she scanned them. They forged deeds, selling our lands over and over again to different buyers. Hartwell uncovered it, hid the evidence here, and they murdered him to bury the truth. Whitehawk's gnarled hands gripped his granddaughter's shoulders. His voice rumbled like distant thunder. This is a blade at the wolves' throats. But they will not stop. They will come with soldiers, rifles, and fire, and the prairie will drink our blood again. Gideon's gaze drifted to the horizon. What had begun as a 12-cent bargain was now a torch in the dark, drawing predators from every shadow. The storm came faster than anyone wished. Within men shifted uneasily in their saddles. Doubt crept into their eyes. They knew, if Crane and Webb had betrayed the Apache, they had surely betrayed their own as well. Crane's face darkened. His voice snapped like a whip. Fire! Gunfire erupted, a storm of bullets slamming into the cabin walls. The Apache answered with their own thunder. War horns bellowed. Flaming arrows streaked across the sky, raining down into the tall grass, igniting the field. The air filled with smoke and the screams of men and beasts. The battle had begun at the gate of the 12-cent cabin. Gideon braced himself at the doorway. His Winchester roared, each shot striking down a soldier who dared to charge. Blood sprayed across the old fence, staining the wood that had already known too much death. Naelli towered beside him, a living wall of fury. Her Colt bucked in her massive hands, each thunderous shot dropping another rider. Firelight danced in her eyes, turning her into the specter of vengeance that the mercenaries had once tried to kill. "Drive them back from the gate," Whitehawk thundered, his spear piercing through a soldier's chest. The old chief fought like the spirit of the earth itself, unyielding, relentless. The ground shook under the clash of hooves, shouts, gunfire, the hiss of arrows. Chaos reigned. The stink of blood and smoke smothered the prairie wind. Webb's men pressed forward with modern rifles, pouring fire into the barricades. But the Apache knew every hollow and rise. They struck from the grass, vanished, then struck again, leaving bodies in their wake. Gideon dropped another man, then bent to reload. A flash of steel caught his eye, a bayonet arcing toward his chest. He twisted aside, but the soldier closed fast. Naelli's hand lashed out like an iron hammer, catching the man mid-strike. She flung him aside as if he weighed nothing, his body crumpling against the fence. "Stand firm, Gideon," she roared, her voice echoing like a war drum. Carried the iron chest and its contents to the office of the federal marshal. There, before the eyes of townsfolk, every paper was read aloud. Names filled the pages. Judge Crane, Governor Webb. Sheriffs, traders, wealthy ranchers. Sums of bribes so vast that the crowd gasped. Each signature was another chain of corruption. Each seal a betrayal burned into the land. The shock spread like fire across 3 counties. A week later, Governor Webb himself, along with his cronies, marched in chains through the streets. People jeered, shouted, hurled curses and stones. The wolves of power had been dragged into the light. The 12-cent cabin had become something greater, a monument to truth. Naelli was hailed as the girl returned from death, the spirit of Apache resistance given flesh. Gideon, once a penniless rancher, now stood as a symbol of justice. Not for his rifle alone, but because he had refused to sell his soul for $500, choosing instead to stand where it was hardest, on the side of what was right. Years later, when prairie winds whispered through the grasslands, a faint glow could still be seen from the old cabin. Gideon Hail sat on the porch, hair silver, shoulders heavy with age. Beside him loomed Naelli, as strong as the hills, her presence a silent vow. Their eyes rested on the gate. Where once a noose had swung with the weight of death, a wooden sign now stood carved with a single word: freedom. That afternoon, the prairie winds howled in long, ragged gusts, dragging red dust across the endless grassland. Above, the sky churned with storm clouds, black and heavy, pressing down like giant funeral shrouds stretched across the heavens. The air itself felt thick, suffocating, as if the world were holding its breath. But Gideon knew the real storm wasn't in the sky. It was rolling toward them on pounding hooves, a thunder of death coming closer with every heartbeat. Naelli sat silently on the porch steps. Her eyes were black and burning like coals, fixed on the Apache warriors working in the yard. They drove sharpened stakes into the dirt, dug shallow pits disguised with grass, and stacked jars of oil near the fire pits, ready to be poured out when the flames rose. The steady thump of hammers and scrape of shovels mixed with the shrieking wind, building into a grim rhythm, like a death drum beating somewhere deep in the earth. Chief Whitehawk walked among his people. His long gray hair whipped in the wind, his weathered face lined with years of war, yet his eyes gleamed bright as naked steel. He spoke to them one by one, his voice low but iron hard. Tonight we are not only defending a house. Tonight we defend the soul of our tribe. If you fall, fall as warriors. Inside the cabin, Gideon sat with his Winchester across his knees, running an oiled rag through the barrel. Each swipe reminded him of the crooked trail that had led him here. A penniless cattleman, trading 12 cents for a house no one else dared claim, and now holding documents that could hang a governor and a judge. Naelli filled the doorway, her tall frame blocking the fading light. Her voice rasped, cracked from smoke and scars. "Do you regret it?" Gideon looked up. His eyes were deep hollows, steady, unblinking. "No, but I know this much. Tonight we either live or we die inside this cabin." Naelli nodded slowly. Her hand tightened around the hilt of her Apache blade, the steel flashing like lightning. "Then if we die as warriors." The sun slipped behind ashes. Gideon stepped onto the porch. Naelli stood beside him, the Apache massed behind with spears and bows raised. Gideon lifted the bundle of papers, his voice hoarse but sharp as a blade. "These papers are enough to hang you and every vulture in your flock." You think I'll hand them over? Murmurs rippled through the soldiers behind Webb. Some glanced at each other, unease written plain in their faces. Webb snarled, teeth bared. Kill them all. Burn it down. Gunfire ripped the air. Bullets screamed past, slamming into the cabin walls, splintering wood, filling the yard with choking smoke. Then came the sound of an Apache war horn, long and fierce, echoing like thunder. Hundreds of flaming arrows arced into the night, falling in showers, igniting the grass in a roaring wave of fire. The battlefield exploded. Gideon vaulted through the window, Winchester roaring. Each shot found a man, bodies tumbling from saddles, blood spraying into the firelit night. He moved through the smoke like a shadow, eyes blazing. Naelli was a fortress of flesh and fury. Her Colt cracked in her massive hand, every shot hurling another rider into the dirt. When the cylinder clicked empty, she hurled the pistol aside, drew her blade, and waded into the melee. Every swing left another enemy sprawled in blood. Crimson soaked her blanket, but she did not falter. Whitehawk led his warriors forward, long spear piercing through armor, tossing men from their mounts. The Apache battle cry rolled like drums of doom, pounding across the prairie. The night drowned in blood. Flames roared, painting the sky red. Smoke billowed thick, stinging eyes and lungs. Horses screamed, men shrieked, bullets whined, arrows hissed. The field became a living nightmare, a hell no one could escape. Through the chaos, Webb spurred his horse straight toward the cabin. His revolver gleamed in his fist, barrel leveled at Gideon. "You ragged fool!" Shoulder, voice deep and solemn. "You chose rightly. You are no longer an outsider. From this day, you are a warrior of the Apache." Naelli stood nearby, her eyes shining. For the first time since she had been strung from that gate, her lips curved into a smile. Brief, but enough to drive back the darkness of the night. Around them, the Apache gathered the dead. They lit fires, singing the mourning songs of their people. The drumbeats carried far into the prairie, slow and steady, a lament for the fallen and a promise to the living. Gideon sat heavy on the steps, lungs burning, heart hammering. He knew Webb would return with more men, more power, and more blood. But for now, they had held. For now, they had kept the house. The 12-cent cabin still stood, and within its bullet-riddled walls burned the fragile flame of justice. The wind swept through, carrying away the smoke and stench of blood. At the gate, where Naelli's body had once hung, now rang the voices of the Apache, rising in unison. Freedom! The morning light crept slowly across a battlefield drowned in silence. The air carried the stench of smoke, the metallic tang of blood, and the bitter smell of charred grass, heavy as if gunpowder itself still clung to the soil. Gideon sat slumped against the porch steps, his weary eyes tracing the bullet holes scattered across the cabin walls. Each scar carved into the wood was a reminder. This house was no longer just shelter. It had become a symbol of resistance. Naelli stood beside him, her face darkened with soot but her eyes alight with an almost fierce brilliance. For the first time in years of being hunted like an animal, she felt she was no longer alone. Around them, The Apache buried their fallen. Small wooden markers rose from the ground as mourners sang the death songs of their people. Drums thudded slow and heavy, echoing across the plains like a funeral march, reminding all that freedom never came without blood. Chief Whitehawk approached Gideon, his gaze solemn. "You have proven yourself. But Webb will not relent. He will return, and he will bring an army. The question is, will you walk this path with us, to the very end?" Gideon was silent. He thought of the years of poverty, of the final coins he had tossed down to buy this forsaken cabin. A bargain so cheap had led him here, to the threshold of life and death. At last he nodded, voice hoarse, broken like ashes carried on wind. "If there's a price to pay, then I'll pay it. Every last drop." News of the battle spread like wildfire. In the towns where men once bowed low before Governor Webb, whispers rose. They said a ragged cattleman and the Apache had shattered the governor's forces. Some claimed the 12-cent cabin had turned into a fortress of justice. The rumors traveled far and fast, carried on prairie winds, rattling the fragile faith the people still had in their rulers. The stories drove Webb into a frenzy. In his marble mansion, he smashed a wineglass and shouted, "A penniless drifter and a pack of red-skinned savages." Battle. Dust rose once more along the horizon. Webb had returned. But this time he did not bring a few hundred gunmen. He brought an army. Wagons thundered forward carrying cannons. Soldiers marched in tight ranks, banners snapping in the wind. Brass horns blared a dirge across the prairie. The Apache watched, some trembling, others gripping their spears tighter. Whitehawk raised his arm, his voice resounding. "This is the land of our ancestors. If we must die, then let us die so our children will know the Apache did not bow." Naelli stood tall, towering like a mountain. She lifted her blade high and roared, "Let fire and blood carve the truth." Gideon clenched his Winchester. There was no fear left in him. Everything was clear now. This would be the final stand. Night fell, and with it came fire and thunder. Cannon shots split the sky, shells exploding against the earth. The cabin shook under the bombardment. Planks splintering, shingles raining down. But from within the smoke rose the deep pounding of Apache drums, the crack of Winchester fire, and the ringing clash of steel. Naelli charged like a storm. Her blade cut through men, her massive hands broke bones, her presence alone scattering fear. Gideon fought beside her, firing until his last round was spent, every shot tearing a gap in the enemy's line. Whitehawk fell, pierced through the chest. But even as he collapsed, he laughed, clutching his spear, crimson spreading wide into the dirt. Webb watched from the rear, his face twisted with rage. He shouted orders, but his ranks faltered. Every wave he sent was repelled by desperate resistance. The night dragged on, an endless slaughter under fire and smoke. At dawn, the field before the cabin was a graveyard. Bodies lay strewn in heaps, horses collapsed with eyes glazed. Fires still burned, black smoke spiraling upward. Only a handful of Apache still stood, bloodied but unbowed, their eyes turned east to the rising sun.